The dust-covered pickup truck rolled to a stop in front of gleaming glass towers that shouldn't exist. Miguel Santos stepped out, his work boots hitting asphalt where his grandmother's garden once grew. For 12 months, he'd been building bridges in Alaska, sending every dollar home to his sick mother. Now luxury condos worth millions occupied the vacant lot his abuela had left him, land he'd never bothered to properly register because who steals from the poor? The developers had done their research, or so they thought. Clean title, no claims, easy money. But Miguel wasn't just any construction worker. 20 years framing houses, reading blueprints, understanding property law from the ground up. He knew something they didn't. His grandmother's will, written in Spanish, filed in the old county records they'd never bothered checking. The penthouse lights twinkled like diamonds above him as Miguel pulled out his phone. Tomorrow, Pinnacle Development would discover their $50 million mistake. Sometimes the system works backward, and the little guy holds the deed. But what Miguel doesn't know is that some developers don't play by legal rules when cornered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miguel's calloused fingers traced the air where Abuela Rosa's lemon tree once stood, its branches heavy with fruit every summer. Now a marble fountain occupied that sacred space, surrounded by manicured hedges and pretentious sculptures. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd probably helped pour the concrete for the foundation given how much work Pinnacle Development controlled in the city. A security guard emerged from the glass lobby, his pressed uniform a stark contrast to Miguel's oil-stained Carhartt jacket. The man's hand rested casually on his radio as he approached, clearly viewing the weathered pickup truck as a blemish on his pristine landscape. "Can I help you?" The guard's tone suggested he'd rather be doing anything else. Miguel studied the man's face, memorizing details the way he'd learned to read structural weaknesses in buildings. Just looking at the construction quality. Nice work. He knocked his knuckles against a decorative stone pillar, though they cut corners on the foundation depth. You can tell by the stress patterns in the mortar. The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. "You work construction?" 20 years. Built half this city." Miguel gestured toward the towers. "Your boss's got permits fast for this project. Usually takes months to get through the bureaucracy. Look, buddy, I just work here. You need to move along." Miguel nodded, but his eyes continued scanning the building's facade. Every detail told a story. Rushed timelines, expensive materials, political connections greased with campaign contributions. The developers had been in a hurry to break ground, probably to beat some zoning change or tax deadline. That haste would be their downfall. As he climbed back into his truck, Miguel's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Mijo, when are you coming home? The medical bills." He'd been sending money north for 18 months, watching his savings evaporate while creditors circled his family like vultures. The Alaska job had paid well, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Every dollar he'd earned building infrastructure in the frozen wilderness had flowed back to keep his mother alive, leaving him with nothing but debt and exhaustion. But now, staring at millions of dollars worth of real estate built on stolen ground, Miguel felt something he hadn't experienced in years: power. The manila envelope on his passenger seat contained copies of documents he'd retrieved from the county recorder's office that afternoon. His grandmother's will, properly notarized and filed in 1987, clearly delineating the property boundaries in Spanish. The deed transfer to Miguel, executed when he turned 18 but never updated with the city planning department. Property tax records showing continuous payments, small amounts that wouldn't attract attention but legally sufficient to maintain ownership. Pinnacle Development had relied on digital records and lazy title searches. They'd missed the paper trail buried in basement filing cabinets, documents that predated computer systems and spoke of a time when the neighborhood was brown faces and working families instead of investment portfolios and gentrification. Miguel started the engine and pulled away from the curb, watching the towers shrink in his rearview mirror. Tomorrow he'd visit the law office of Maria Gutierrez, a fierce Latina attorney who specialized in David versus Goliath cases. She'd represented his cousin in a workplace injury suit and had a reputation for making corporate lawyers sweat. The radio crackled with late-night talk shows and distant music as Miguel drove through streets he'd known since childhood. Corner stores had become artisanal coffee shops. Modest homes had been demolished for luxury townhouses. Progress, they called it, as if erasing history was somehow inevitable. But sometimes history fought back. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Unknown number, probably another debt collector. Miguel let it go to voicemail, but the caller tried again immediately. Then again. On the fourth ring, he answered. "Mr. Santos?" The voice was smooth, professional, with an undertone that raised the hair on Miguel's neck. "I think we need to talk." The receptionist's manicured nails clicked against her keyboard as Marcus stood dripping rainwater onto the polished marble floor of Pinnacle Development's lobby. Everything about this place screamed money, from the abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars to the coffee machine that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. "I'm sorry. Mr. Chen is in meetings all afternoon," she said without looking up, her voice carrying that practiced dismissiveness reserved for people who didn't arrive in $1,000 suits. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the photo he'd taken of the construction sign. "Tell him it's about the Riverside Gardens project. He'll want to see me." She glanced at the screen, then at his work boots and flannel shirt, clearly weighing whether this was worth interrupting her boss for. After a moment that stretched too long, she picked up her phone. "Mr. Chen, there's someone here about Riverside Gardens." A pause. "No, sir, he doesn't have an appointment." Another pause, longer this time. Marcus weighed. Marcus watched her expression shift from boredom to something approaching interest as she listened to whatever Chen was saying on the other end. "Please take a seat. He'll be right down." The waiting area featured leather chairs that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, arranged around a glass table displaying architectural magazines and what looked like awards for luxury development. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the city sprawling below, all glass and steel reaching toward grey clouds. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened and a man in his 50s emerged, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. David Chen wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, and his handshake was firm but calculated. "Mr. Wade, this is unexpected." Chen's smile was professional, revealing nothing. "I understand you have questions about one of our projects." Questions isn't quite the word I'd use. Chen gestured toward the elevator. "Why don't we discuss this in my office?" The ride up was silent, but Marcus could feel Chen studying him in the reflection of the polished steel doors. The office occupied a corner of the 20th floor, with views of the river and, Marcus realized with a bitter irony, a perfect sight line to where his grandmother's house had stood. "Coffee? Water?" Chen moved behind his desk, a massive piece of dark wood that dominated half the room. "I'm good." Marcus remained standing, letting his eyes sweep across the framed photographs covering one wall. Chen shaking hands with mayors, groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, a shrine to a man who made his living reshaping the world. Chen settled into his chair, fingers steepled. Riverside Gardens. Beautiful project, really. 42 luxury units, each with river views. "We broke ground 18 months ago. On land you don't own." The words hung in the air between them. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm sorry. I think there's been some confusion. Pinnacle Development has clear title to every square foot of that property. Our legal department is extremely thorough." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. The deed his grandmother had pressed into his hands years ago, yellowed with age but still legal. He placed it on Chen's desk. "Agnes Wade, my grandmother. She left me that land when she died, along with the house that stood on it." Marcus watched Chen's face as he scanned the document. Funny thing about paperwork. Sometimes the most important pieces never make it into official files. Chen read the deed twice, his composure cracking slightly around the edges. This appears to be legitimate, but our records show... Your records show what you wanted them to show. Question is, how thorough was that legal department when it came to checking for unregistered inheritances? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. Chen set the deed down carefully, as if it might explode. Even if this document is valid, he said finally, you've been absent for years. There are adverse possession laws, abandonment clauses. 1 year. I've been gone exactly 1 year, working a job in Alaska to pay for my grandmother's medical bills. Marcus leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. Pretty sure the statute of limitations on family inheritance runs a bit longer than that. Chen's phone buzzed. He ignored it. What is it you want, Mr. Wade? Money. We can discuss reasonable compensation for any inconvenience. Inconvenience? Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. You bulldozed my family's home and built condos for rich people on land that belongs to me. You want to call that an inconvenience? Through the window, construction cranes dotted the skyline like mechanical vultures. Marcus wondered how many other families had been swept aside to make room for progress, how many other deeds were gathering dust in forgotten filing cabinets. No, he said quietly, I don't want money. Chen waited, probably calculating, strategizing, looking for the angle that would make this problem disappear. Marcus smiled for the first time since returning to the city. I want everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Miguel approached the chain-link fence. Workers were already busy, their hard hats bobbing like colorful buoys in a sea of concrete and steel. He recognized the rhythm, the same purposeful chaos he'd been part of countless times before. Excuse me, Miguel called to a supervisor in a yellow vest. Who's the foreman on this project? The man looked up from his clipboard, squinting against the glare. That'd be Tony Castellano, red trailer over there. He pointed toward a cluster of temporary buildings. You looking for work? Miguel almost smiled. Something like that. The red trailer sat on concrete blocks, its aluminum siding already showing wear from the desert wind. Miguel climbed the metal steps and knocked. A gruff voice told him to enter. Tony Castellano was exactly what central casting would order for a construction foreman. Thick forearms, weathered face, and eyes that had seen every possible way a job could go sideways. He looked up from a spread of blueprints. Help you? I'm Miguel Santos. I wanted to talk about this land you're building on. Yeah? You from the city? Because we got all our permits in order. Miguel pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, a copy of his grandfather's will he'd retrieved from a lawyer's office that morning. Actually, I think there might be a problem with the ownership. Tony's expression shifted from mild irritation to careful attention. He'd been in construction long enough to know that ownership disputes could shut down a project faster than a gas leak. What kind of problem? Miguel handed him the will. My grandfather owned this land. Left it to me when he died. Thing is, I was overseas when he passed, and some paperwork never got filed properly. Tony studied the document, his frown deepening with each line. This is from 2019. October 15th, 2019. I can show you the deed too if you want. Jesus Christ. Tony rubbed his forehead. You telling me we're building on stolen land? I'm telling you that whoever sold this to Pinnacle Development Company didn't have the right to sell it. The trailer fell silent except for the hum of a small air conditioner struggling against the heat. Tony looked at the blueprints spread across his desk, then back at Miguel. You got a lawyer? Getting one. Good. Because this is way above my pay grade. Tony reached for his phone. I need to call the main office. Before you do that, Miguel said, settling into the plastic chair across from the desk. Maybe you could tell me about the project. How many units? What's the timeline? Tony hesitated, his finger hovering over the phone. Why? Because in about 10 minutes, this whole job is going to become a lot more complicated. Thought you might want to know what you're dealing with." Something in Miguel's tone made Tony put the phone down. 64 units. Luxury condos, starting at 400,000. We're supposed to have the first building finished by Christmas. How much has Meridian invested so far? That's not really. Tony, in about an hour, there's going to be lawyers crawling all over this place. The more I understand about what's happening here, the better chance we have of working something out that doesn't leave you and your crew unemployed. Tony was quiet for a long moment. Between foundation work and the steel that's already up, probably 3-4 million, plus they bought the land for 800,000. Miguel whistled softly. That's a lot of money to have tied up in someone else's property. You're really going to fight this? The land belongs to me. My family's been here for 3 generations. Miguel stood up. But I'm not unreasonable. There might be a way to work this out. What kind of way? Miguel moved to the trailer's small window and looked out at the construction site. Dozens of workers moving with purpose, building something that was supposed to last. Tell me about Richard Meridian. What's he like to work for? Rich, connected. Not the kind of guy who likes being told he made a mistake. Good thing I'm not asking him to admit a mistake then. Tony's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and his face went pale. Speak of the devil. He's on his way out here. Some investor meeting. Miguel smiled for the first time since walking into the trailer. Perfect timing. You don't understand. This guy's got half the city council in his pocket. He's not going to just roll over because you wave some old papers around. Maybe not, Miguel said, moving toward the door. But here's what Mr. Meridian doesn't understand yet. I've got nothing to lose and all the time in the world. How do you think that equation's going to work out for him? He left Tony staring at the will, the sound of construction continuing outside, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus crouched behind a stack of lumber, watching the early crew arrive. He'd been there since dawn, learning their routines, memorizing faces. Knowledge was power, and after yesterday's encounter with Rebecca Chen, he needed all the power he could gather. His phone buzzed. A text from Tommy found something. Meet at diner on 5th. Marcus slipped away from the site, his work boots crunching on gravel. The city felt different now. Every glass tower a reminder of what could be taken, every construction crane a symbol of unchecked ambition. He'd spent the last year building other people's dreams in distant cities. Now he was home to reclaim his own. The diner smelled like bacon grease and broken promises. Tommy sat in a corner booth, a manila folder spread before him like a war map. His weathered face bore the grim satisfaction of a man who'd found exactly what he'd hoped he wouldn't. Sit down, Marcus. You're gonna want to hear this. Marcus slid into the cracked vinyl seat. What'd you find? Tommy pushed a stack of documents across the table. Your old man was smarter than we gave him credit for. Look at this. The papers were yellowed with age, covered in legal terminology that made Marcus's head spin. But certain phrases jumped out. Mineral rights, subsurface ownership, perpetual easement. English, Tommy. Your dad didn't just own the surface land. He owned everything underneath it too. Water rights, mineral rights, even the airspace up to 200 feet. Tommy's finger traced a particular clause. And here's the beautiful part. He filed a declaration of intent with the county back in '98. Never followed through with full registration, but the intent creates a legal cloud on the title. Marcus looked up from the papers. Meaning Meridian Development's ownership isn't as clean as they think. They bought the land from the city, but the city never had clear title to sell it. Your father's declaration creates what lawyers call a competing claim. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, oblivious to the gravity of their conversation. Marcus stared at the documents, seeing his father in a new light. The man who'd seemed defeated by life had actually been planning for this moment. There's more, Tommy continued. I called my buddy at the water department. That whole development? It's sitting on top of an underground spring. Your dad's water rights mean they can't legally access their own water supply without your permission. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a tightening that was part vindication, part responsibility. What about the people living there now? The families in those condos? That's the thing about developers like Meridian. They cut corners, take risks, bet on no one ever challenging them. Those families? They're victims too. Their titles are clouded now. Marcus's phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Rivera? The voice was crisp, professional. This is James Kellerman, attorney for Meridian Development. I understand you've been asking questions about the Riverside Commons project. Word travels fast. We'd like to discuss this matter with you. Perhaps we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone involved. Marcus looked at Tommy, who was shaking his head vigorously. I'm listening. Excellent. Can you meet us at our offices this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? I'll be there. After hanging up, Marcus faced Tommy's disapproving stare. You're walking into the lion's den, son? Maybe. Or maybe it's time the lions met someone who's not afraid to bite back. Marcus spent the morning at the county courthouse, pulling every record he could find about his father's property. The clerk, a tired woman with kind eyes, helped him navigate the bureaucratic maze. Haven't seen interest in these old files in years, she said, photocopying documents. Your father came in here once, back when I was new. Seemed like a man carrying the weight of the world. What did he want? Same thing you're looking for, I imagine. Proof that he mattered. That his family's claim to this land meant something. By noon, Marcus had assembled a complete picture. His father hadn't just owned the land, he'd owned it in ways that made development nearly impossible without his family's consent. The city had seized the property for unpaid taxes, but they'd never properly addressed the underlying claims. Marcus walked the streets of his childhood, seeing them through different eyes. The bodega where he'd bought candy was now a boutique coffee shop. The playground where he'd learned to fight was now a pocket park with designer benches. Progress wasn't inherently evil, but it should honor what came before. At 1:45, Marcus stood before the glass tower housing Meridian Development's offices. He wore his best jeans and a clean work shirt, not trying to be something he wasn't, but showing respect for the gravity of the moment. The lobby was all marble and intimidation, designed to make ordinary people feel small. But Marcus wasn't ordinary anymore. He was a man with legitimate power in a world that had always told him he had none. He straightened his shoulders and walked toward the elevator, his father's documents tucked securely under his arm. The rain had stopped by the time Marcus reached the downtown offices of Meridian Development Group, but water still dripped from fire escapes and awnings, creating a steady percussion against the pavement. He stood across the street, studying the gleaming glass tower that housed the company that had stolen his land. 23 floors of steel and ambition, each window reflecting the grey morning sky like dead eyes. His phone buzzed. Sarah's text was brief. Found something. Meet me at the diner on 5th in an hour. Marcus pocketed the phone and crossed the street. The lobby was all marble and chrome, designed to intimidate. A security guard in a crisp uniform looked up from his desk as Marcus approached, taking in the worn jeans and work boots with obvious disdain. Can I help you? I'm here to see Richard Blackwood. The guard's expression shifted to barely concealed amusement. Do you have an appointment? No. But tell him Marcus Wade is here about the Riverside property. Something flickered in the guard's eyes, recognition maybe, or concern. He picked up his phone and spoke in hushed tones. After a moment he hung up and pointed toward the elevators. 22nd floor. Someone will meet you. The elevator ride felt endless. Marcus watched the numbers climb and thought about his grandmother's hands, weathered and strong, pointing out property lines that existed long before surveys and deeds. She'd walked every inch of that land with him, teaching him which trees marked the boundaries, where the old well had been, how the creek bent around their corner of the world. The elevator doors opened to reveal a woman in her 30s, blonde hair pulled back severely, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Mr. Wade? I'm Jennifer Collins, Mr. Blackwood's assistant. He's in a meeting, but I'll wait. She led him down a hallway lined with architectural renderings and photos of completed projects. Marcus recognized some of the locations, neighborhoods that had been gentrified beyond recognition, their original character scraped away and replaced with glass boxes for the wealthy. The waiting area overlooked the construction site that had once been his land. From this height, he could see the entire development, 6 buildings in various stages of completion, cranes swinging loads of steel and concrete, dozens of workers moving like ants across what had once been his grandmother's garden. Impressive, isn't it? Marcus turned to find a man in his 50s approaching, silver-haired and confident, with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Richard Blackwood extended a manicured hand. "Mr. Wade, I've been expecting you." "Have you?" Blackwood gestured toward his office. "Please, let's talk privately." The office was a monument to success. Awards on the walls, photos with politicians and celebrities, a wet bar in the corner. Blackwood settled behind his desk while Marcus remained standing. "I understand you believe you have some claim to the Riverside property." "I don't believe anything. I know I own it." Blackwood's smile widened. "Mr. Wade, I appreciate your passion, but ownership requires documentation, legal documentation. What you have are memories and stories. What I have are permits, surveys, and clear title. You have fraudulent documents." "That's a serious accusation." Blackwood's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes had gone cold. "One that could get you into serious legal trouble." Marcus pulled out the folder Sarah had given him and dropped it on the desk. "Your survey is off by 12 feet on the eastern boundary. The property description in your deed doesn't match the actual land. And somehow, mysteriously, the tax records show the land was sold for back taxes when no tax notices were ever sent to the correct address." For the first time, Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. He opened the folder and scanned the contents, his expression growing darker with each page. "Even if there were irregularities," he said finally, "which I'm not admitting, you're looking at years of litigation, appeals, injunctions. By the time any court sorted this out, Riverside Commons would be completed and fully occupied. The cost of reversing everything would be astronomical. So, you admit you stole my land?" Blackwood leaned back in his chair. "I admit nothing, but I'm a reasonable man. Perhaps we can work something out, a settlement. Cash payment for your inconvenience." "How much?" 50,000, more than generous for an empty lot. Marcus almost laughed. The land was worth 20 times that, and the completed development would generate millions. He walked to the window and looked down at the construction site, watching a concrete mixer navigate between piles of rebar and lumber. "I want you to stop construction," he said without turning around. "Impossible." "Then enjoy the lawsuit." Marcus headed for the door. "And Mr. Blackwood? That land has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built the first house there with his own hands. My grandmother planted every tree you cut down. You can buy judges and forge documents, but you can't change that. This isn't over." The elevator couldn't move fast enough. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus watched from his truck, parked a block away with a clear view of the Riverside luxury condominiums. Coffee steamed from a paper cup in his hands, but he barely noticed its warmth. His attention was fixed on the rhythm of the site. Workers arriving in clusters, supervisors huddling near the trailer that served as their temporary office. The steady hum of machinery preparing for another day of progress on stolen ground. At 7:30 sharp, a black Mercedes pulled into the reserved parking space closest to the trailer. Marcus recognized the driver immediately, Harold Brennan, the site supervisor he'd spoken with yesterday. But it was the passenger who made Marcus sit up straighter, a woman in an expensive navy suit, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Even from this distance, her movements conveyed authority. Marcus pulled out his phone and took several photos as the woman emerged from the car. She moved like someone accustomed to being in charge, gesturing sharply as she spoke to Brennan. Whatever she was saying had the supervisor nodding rapidly, his posture submissive in a way Marcus hadn't seen the day before. This had to be someone higher up the food chain, someone who might actually have answers. 20 minutes later, Marcus watched as Brennan's crew gathered for their morning briefing. The woman stood slightly apart, observing everything with calculating eyes. When one of the younger workers asked a question about foundation specs, she stepped forward and answered with technical precision that surprised Marcus. This wasn't just some executive playing dress-up at a construction site. Marcus finished his coffee and started his truck. Time to make another introduction. He parked in the same spot as yesterday and walked toward the site entrance with deliberate confidence. The security guard recognized him and tensed, but Marcus offered a friendly wave. "Morning, Tony. Beautiful day to build on stolen land, don't you think?" Before Tony could respond, Marcus spotted Brennan emerging from the trailer with the woman in the navy suit. Perfect timing. "Mr. Brennan," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the site. "Glad I caught you. And who might this be?" The woman's eyes locked onto Marcus immediately, assessing him with the same intensity she'd shown when surveying the construction. Up close, she was probably in her 50s, with intelligent grey eyes and the kind of composure that came from years of handling difficult situations. "This is private property," she said before Brennan could speak. "You need to leave." Marcus smiled, pulling the property deed from his jacket pocket. Funny thing about private property, it helps to actually own it. He unfolded the document halfway, just enough to show the official seals and legal text. "I'm Marcus Chen. I believe you're building on my land." The woman's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught the subtle way her eyes flicked to the deed, then back to his face. She was processing, calculating. "I'm Victoria Whitmore, project manager for Riverside Development," she said finally. "And I think there's been some confusion. This property was purchased through proper legal channels." "From who?" Marcus asked mildly. "Because according to this deed, registered with the county recorder's office just yesterday, I'm the sole owner of the land you're standing on." Brennan looked like he wanted to disappear, but Victoria remained steady. "Property transfers are complex matters, Mr. Chen. There are often multiple claims and competing interests that need to be resolved through proper legal channels." "You mean, like the proper legal channel where someone actually owns the property before you build on it?" Marcus folded the deed and tucked it away. "I'm curious, Miss Whitmore, how exactly did your company come to believe it owned my land?" For the first time, Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Just a tightening around her eyes, a pause that lasted a fraction too long. "As I said, these matters are complex. I'm sure our legal team can resolve any misunderstanding." "Oh, I'm sure they're very good at resolving misunderstandings," Marcus agreed, "especially the kind that involve poor families losing their property through foreclosure proceedings that maybe didn't follow all the proper procedures." Victoria's face went very still. "I think this conversation is over, Mr. Chen." "Actually, it's just getting started." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the screen, a photo of her arriving that morning with Brennan. "I'm documenting everything now. Every day of continued construction on my property, every day of trespass, every conversation where your people try to intimidate the rightful owner." He pocketed the phone and smiled. "You can reach me through my attorney if you'd like to discuss compensation for the use of my land. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow to check on your progress." As Marcus walked away, he could feel Victoria's eyes boring into his back. He'd rattled her, not enough to make her panic, but enough to know she was taking him seriously now. The game had officially begun. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Chen's corner office as he paced behind his mahogany desk, cell phone pressed to his ear. His perfectly pressed shirt showed the first signs of strain, a thin line of perspiration at the collar despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Do you mean the permits are being reviewed?" His voice carried the edge of a man accustomed to having problems solved with a phone call. "Judge Morrison assured me this wouldn't be an issue." The voice on the other end delivered more bad news. Marcus's jaw tightened as he listened, his free hand drumming an agitated rhythm against the window overlooking the Riverside Heights development. "Find out who's behind this. Someone's pulling strings downtown, and I want to know who." He ended the call with more force than necessary. 3 floors below, Jake sat in his truck at the construction site's edge, watching the morning shift arrive. Hard hats bobbed between the skeletal frames of unfinished units, while cement mixers rumbled to life. The symphony of construction that had once been his world now felt foreign, almost mocking. His phone buzzed. Tommy's name appeared on the screen. "You see the news this morning?" Tommy's voice crackled through the speaker. "Been busy." "What news?" "Channel 8 ran a piece about developers cutting corners on safety inspections." Guess whose project got featured prominently? Jake felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. Interesting timing. Yeah, real interesting. Especially since I might have mentioned to my cousin Rita, she works at the station, how some developers around here have been rushing through inspections. Crazy how these things get around. The first move had been simpler than Jake anticipated. A few phone calls from Tommy to former colleagues still working city jobs, combined with Rita's investigative instincts, had put Chen Development under a microscope they clearly weren't prepared for. Jake watched as a black sedan pulled up to the construction trailer. Marcus Chen emerged, his usual confident stride replaced by sharp, purposeful movements. Even from a distance, Jake could read the tension in the developer's shoulders. "Tommy, I need you to make another call. Remember that OSHA inspector who owed you a favor? Danny Reeves." "Yeah, what about him?" "Think he'd be interested in an anonymous tip about potential safety violations at Riverside Heights?" Tommy's chuckle was audible through the phone. "I think Danny takes his job very seriously, especially when it comes to protecting workers." 20 minutes later, Jake watched 2 official-looking vehicles pull into the construction site. Men in hard hats and clipboards emerged, their presence immediately drawing concerned glances from the work crews. One of the vehicles bore the unmistakable OSHA logo. Through the trailer's windows, Jake could see Marcus gesticulating wildly at someone on his phone. The developer's morning was clearly not improving. Jake's own phone rang. Unknown number. "This is Jake." "Mr. Morrison, this is Sandra Walsh from Walsh, Peterson and Associates. I represent Chen Development Corporation." Jake had been expecting this call, though perhaps not quite this soon. "What can I do for you, Ms. Walsh?" "I think the better question is what we can do for you. My client is prepared to make a very generous offer for your property. We understand there may have been some confusion about the land ownership." "No confusion on my end." "Of course. Perhaps we could meet to discuss this matter. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that benefits everyone involved." Jake watched as more officials arrived at the construction site. A small crowd was gathering, workers, supervisors, and what looked like a few reporters alerted by the morning news coverage. "I'm pretty busy this week," Jake said, not trying to hide his lack of interest in a quick resolution. "Mr. Morrison, I feel compelled to mention that legal battles can be expensive and time-consuming. My client simply wants to resolve this matter efficiently." "Miss Walsh, let me save you some time. Your client built luxury condos on land he doesn't own, then tried to sell them to people who had every reason to believe the transaction was legitimate. Now he's got a problem that money might not solve." A pause on the other end. When the lawyer spoke again, her tone had shifted from conciliatory to businesslike. "What exactly is it that you want, Mr. Morrison?" Jake started his truck's engine, the diesel rumbling to life. Through the windshield, he could see Marcus Chen emerging from the trailer, his face flushed as he gestured angrily at the OSHA inspectors. "Miss Walsh, I want what everyone wants, justice. Problem is, your client and I have very different definitions of that word." He ended the call and put the truck in gear. As he drove away from Riverside Heights, Jake caught a glimpse of Marcus Chen in his rearview mirror, standing amid the chaos of halted construction, looking like a man finally realizing that his perfectly ordered world was about to become very complicated. The real game was just beginning. Marcus stood in the shadow of the construction crane, watching the morning shift workers file through the security checkpoint. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd walked through similar gates for 15 years, lunch pail in hand, hard hat under his arm. Now he was on the other side of the fence, literally and figuratively. His phone buzzed. Sarah's voice crackled through the speaker. "The injunction hearing is set for Thursday. Judge Morrison's docket." Morrison. Marcus tested the name. "What do we know about him?" "Old school. Respects property rights, hates corporate overreach. But Marcus, there's something else. I've been digging into Meridian's financing structure." Her voice dropped. "This isn't just about your land. They've leveraged everything: pension funds, municipal bonds, private investors. If this project fails, it takes down half the city's development budget with it." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. "You're saying I'm not just fighting Meridian. I'm saying you're fighting the entire machine that keeps this city's growth going. And that machine has teeth." After hanging up, Marcus noticed the black sedan that had been parked across from the coffee shop for the past hour. Same one he'd seen outside his motel yesterday. He pulled his hood up and walked 3 blocks before ducking into an alley. Sure enough, the sedan crept past, windows tinted dark as midnight. The paranoia felt familiar. In Afghanistan, staying alive meant watching shadows, reading the spaces between words. But this was supposed to be home. His phone rang again. Unknown number. Marcus Chen. The voice was smooth, professional. "My name is Richard Holbrook. I represent certain interested parties in the Riverside development situation. I don't know any Richard Holbrook, but I know you. Army Corps of Engineers, 3 tours overseas, exemplary service record, currently employed by Brennan Construction out of Phoenix. Or were, until you took extended leave." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "To offer you an alternative to this unpleasant legal business. My clients are prepared to offer you fair market value for your property. $750,000 cash, no questions asked. You could buy a nice place in Phoenix, close to your job, start fresh. And if I say no..." The pause stretched long enough for Marcus to hear traffic in the background. "Then you continue down a very expensive, very public path that might not end the way you hope. Legal battles are costly, Mr. Chen. Sometimes they uncover things people prefer to keep buried." The threat was subtle but clear. Marcus thought about his discharge paperwork, the incident reports that had been classified, the reasons he'd left the army and kept moving ever since. "I'll think about it," he said, then hung up. That evening, Marcus sat in Tony's bar, nursing a beer and studying the faces in the mirror behind the bottles. Tony wiped glasses with mechanical precision, the way men do when they're thinking hard about something else. "You know," Tony said without looking up, "my grandfather came here from Sicily with nothing, worked the docks, saved every penny, bought this building in 1952. 68 years my family's owned this place." Marcus waited. Tony had that look men get before they tell you something important. "Last month, Meridian Development made me an offer. Said the whole block's being rezoned, whether I sell or not. Property taxes are going to triple next year." Tony set down the glass and finally met Marcus's eyes in the mirror. "What I'm saying is, you're not the only one they're squeezing. You think I should take their money? I think you should know what you're really fighting." Tony pulled out a manila folder from under the bar. "My nephew works for the city planning department. Figured you might want to see this." The documents inside made Marcus's blood run cold. Meridian's project wasn't just about luxury condos. Phase 2 called for a shopping complex where Tony's bar stood. Phase 3 would level the low-income housing 6 blocks east, where most of the families displaced by rising rents had moved. "It's not about one piece of land," Marcus said quietly. "Never was." Tony poured himself a shot of whiskey. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Marcus thought about the workers he'd watched that morning, filing through the gates with their lunch pails and hard hats. Thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd served him coffee and called him mijo, like he was her own son. Thought about the kids playing in the street where his grandmother had taught him to ride a bike. "I'm going to stop them." Tony raised his glass. "Then you better be ready for war." As Marcus walked back to his motel, the black sedan was nowhere to be seen, but he felt eyes on him anyway, watching from windows and doorways, measuring his resolve. The machine was bigger than he'd imagined, its reach longer, its hunger deeper. But machines, he'd learned in the army, always had weak points. You just had to find them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus stood at the edge of what used to be his grandmother's vegetable garden. Where tomatoes and peppers once grew, concrete foundations now stretched like scars across the earth. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent the last year pouring foundations just like these in Dallas, never imagining he'd return to find his own legacy buried beneath someone else's dream. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena, meeting set for 2 p.m. Whitmore's bringing lawyers. You ready for this? Marcus pocketed the phone without responding. Ready was a relative term. He'd been preparing for this moment since discovering the condos 3 days ago, but readiness felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. What he had instead was certainty, the bone-deep knowledge that his grandmother's stories about this land, about their family's connection to it, were worth more than any legal document Whitmore Construction could produce. A black sedan pulled up to the construction trailer, followed by a sleek BMW. Marcus watched from his position near the old oak tree, the only thing the developers had left standing, probably because it would have cost too much to remove. Thomas Whitmore emerged from the BMW, his silver hair catching the light as he gestured animatedly to the 3 men in suits who'd stepped out of the sedan. Marcus had done his homework on Whitmore. The man had built half the commercial district downtown, always staying just within the bounds of legality, but pushing every ethical boundary he could find. Local newspapers called him a visionary. The families displaced by his projects called him something else entirely. Moving closer, Marcus could hear fragments of their conversation drifting across the construction site. Title search was clean. I'm telling you, one of the lawyers was saying. Then how the hell does some nobody construction worker have a claim that predates our purchase? Whitmore's voice carried the edge of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. The county records show a gap in 1987. There was a fire at the courthouse that year, destroyed a lot of property documents. It's possible. Whitmore cut him off with a sharp gesture. Possible doesn't build condos or pay investors. I need solutions, not possibilities. Marcus stepped out from behind the oak tree, his work boots crunching on the gravel. The conversation stopped abruptly as 4 pairs of eyes fixed on him. He'd chosen his outfit carefully. Clean jeans, a pressed flannel shirt, his best boots. He wanted them to see a landowner, not just another day laborer they could intimidate. Mr. Whitmore, Marcus said, extending his hand. Marcus Chen, I believe we have some business to discuss. Whitmore's handshake was firm, calculating. Up close, the developer looked older than his publicity photos, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long nights and difficult decisions. But there was steel there too, the kind Marcus had seen in foremen who'd clawed their way up from nothing. Mr. Chen, I'll be honest with you, this claim of yours has caught us off guard. My legal team assures me there must be some misunderstanding. One of the lawyers stepped forward, brandishing a thick folder. Mr. Chen, we've reviewed the county records extensively. There's no record of any Chen family ownership of this property. The land was purchased legally from Riverside Holdings in 2019. Marcus had expected this. Riverside Holdings bought it from the county in a tax sale, isn't that right? The lawyer's slight hesitation was answer enough. That's correct, but after my grandmother died, and the property taxes went unpaid for 3 years, Marcus continued. But here's the thing. You can't sell what was never legally yours to begin with. He pulled a weathered envelope from his jacket pocket. Inside were photocopies of documents Elena had helped him track down from the state archives, records that predated the courthouse fire, showing his great-grandfather's original land grant from 1952. Your title search missed a few things, Marcus said, watching the lawyer's expressions shift as they examined the papers. Turns out the county never had clear title to sell to Riverside Holdings, which means Riverside never had clear title to sell to you. The silence stretched long enough for a mockingbird to run through its entire repertoire from somewhere in the oak tree's branches. Finally, Whitmore spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Even if these documents are authentic, Mr. Chen, you're looking at years of litigation. legal fees that would bankrupt most people. And in the meantime, we have construction loans, investor commitments, contracts with buyers. A lot of people stand to lose a lot of money if this project doesn't move forward. Marcus met the developer's gaze steadily. That sounds like your problem, not mine. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for the inconvenience we've caused. I'm prepared to listen, Marcus said. But first, I think we should take a walk. The law office of Harrison and Associates looked like it was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors, and leather-bound books that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Marcus felt the weight of every expensive fixture as he walked through the reception area, his work boots silent on the polished stone. He'd traded his usual flannel for a clean button-down, but he still looked like exactly what he was, a man who worked with his hands in a world built for people who worked with contracts and loopholes. "Mr. Chen will see you now," the receptionist said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced politeness that barely concealed disdain. She gestured toward a conference room where 3 men in identical navy suits were already seated. Richard Chen sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating the confidence of someone who'd never lost a negotiation. To his left sat a younger man Marcus recognized from the construction site, probably the project manager. The third man looked like hired muscle dressed in Armani. "Mr. Rodriguez." Chen stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for coming. I believe we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting how Chen's grip was firm but his palms were soft. "That's what I'm hoping for." They sat across from each other like opposing generals before a battle. Chen opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a document thick enough to stop a bullet. "We've prepared what we believe is a very generous offer," Chen began. $5 million for your claim to the property, with a quick closing that could have money in your account within the week. Marcus had expected this moment, but hearing the number still hit him like a punch to the gut. 5 million. More money than he'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to disappear, to start over anywhere, to never worry about rent or groceries or whether his truck would start in the morning. "That's a lot of money," he said carefully. Chen's smile was practiced, predatory. "It is, especially considering the alternative might be years of legal battles with uncertain outcomes. Court cases are expensive, Mr. Rodriguez. They have a way of draining resources." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus kept his face neutral. "I'll need to think about it." "Of course, but I should mention, this offer has a very short window, 24 hours. Market conditions, you understand. Time is money in this business." Marcus stood, leaving the contract untouched on the table. "I'll be in touch." As he walked toward the door, Chen's voice followed him. "Mr. Rodriguez, you seem like a practical man, a working man. Don't let pride cost you a comfortable future." The elevator ride down felt endless. In the lobby, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Elena's number. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "They offered 5 million. The silence stretched long enough that he wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Elena spoke. That's a life-changing amount of money, Marcus." "I know. Are you going to take it?" Marcus walked out onto the street, where the sounds of traffic and construction created a symphony he understood better than conference room negotiations. "I keep thinking about what my grandfather would say." "What do you think he'd say?" Marcus watched a crew of workers across the street, men who looked like him, who probably struggled with the same bills and worries he'd carried for years. "He used to tell me that some things can't be bought or sold, that a man's word and his land were the only things that really belonged to him." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was. He was also poor his whole life." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Money isn't everything, Marcus, but it's something, and 5 million could solve a lot of problems." Marcus knew she was right. 5 million could pay for his sister's medical bills, could send his nephew to college, could give him security he'd never known. It was practical. It was smart. It was also surrender. "There's something else," he said. Chen gave me 24 hours to decide, but I don't think he's planning to wait that long. What do you mean? The way he looked at me, the muscle he had in the room. These aren't people who accept no for an answer. Marcus ducked into an alley, lowering his voice. I think I need to assume they're going to try something. Marcus, maybe you should call the police. And tell them what? That a developer made me nervous? He shook his head. No, I need to be smart about this. I need to be ready. As he hung up, Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. In 24 hours, he'd either be $5 million richer or he'd be in a fight that could cost him everything. Either way, the easy choices were behind him. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Marcus kept the mug in his hands anyway, letting the ceramic anchor him as he stared at the documents spread across Elena's kitchen table. Sarah Chen sat across from him, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keys as she cross-referenced property records with building permits. Timeline doesn't add up, she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. Look at this. Blackstone filed for the construction permits 3 months before your grandfather's death. They knew he was sick, Marcus. They were counting on the land changing hands without anyone paying attention. Elena leaned against the counter, arms crossed. That's not just opportunistic, that's predatory. Marcus felt the familiar burn in his chest, the same rage that had been building since he'd first seen those gleaming towers. But now it was different, colder, more focused. What else did you find? Sarah turned her laptop toward him. Environmental impact reports that were fast-tracked, zoning changes that happened overnight. And here's the interesting part. 3 city council members received campaign contributions from shell companies linked to Blackstone Holdings right before the votes. How much are we talking about? Enough to matter, not enough to be obvious. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this pattern before. It's textbook corruption, but proving it in court would take years and millions in legal fees. Marcus stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the construction site. Even in the darkness, he could see the security lights illuminating the half-finished 4th tower. Workers would be back at sunrise, laying foundation for wealth built on stolen ground. There's something else, Sarah said quietly. I made some calls to sources at the housing authority. Those luxury units? They're being pre-sold to foreign investors. Empty investments. The whole complex is going to be a ghost town for rich people's money. While families like the Garcias get pushed out of their homes, Elena added bitterly. Marcus turned back to them. Then we hit them where it hurts most. What do you mean? Sarah's voice carried a note of caution. Their timeline. Their investors. Marcus moved back to the table, spreading out the construction schedules Elena had photographed. Look at these completion dates. They're locked into delivering finished units by specific deadlines. If they miss those dates, the pre-sales fall through, Sarah finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. The financing agreements have penalty clauses. More than that, Marcus said, his mind racing through possibilities. International investors don't like uncertainty. They start getting nervous, they pull out entirely, and if word gets out that the whole project is built on fraudulent land acquisition, Elena straightened. You're talking about taking down a multi-million-dollar development. I'm talking about taking back what's mine. Sarah closed her laptop, her expression serious. Marcus, what you're suggesting, if you're thinking about sabotage or anything illegal, nothing illegal, Marcus cut her off. Just the truth. At the right time, in the right way, to the right people. He walked to Elena's bookshelf, where she kept her father's old construction manuals. The weight of inherited knowledge, passed down through generations of men who'd built this city with their bare hands. Men who'd been forgotten when the towers went up. I've been thinking about this wrong, he said, turning back to face them. I've been focused on proving ownership, on legal battles I can't win. But ownership isn't just about paperwork. What else is it about? Elena asked. Power, control, making the cost of fighting you higher than the cost of working with you. Sarah packed up her laptop, but Marcus could see the journalist's gleam in her eyes. What do you need from me? Keep digging. Find every dirty deal, every cut corner, every bribe. Build a file that could bury Blackstone Holdings completely. And then we give them a choice. Deal with me fairly or deal with the consequences. Elena moved to stand beside him at the window. You know they won't just roll over. These people didn't get rich by backing down from fights. Neither did my grandfather, Marcus said. He just fought his battles differently. This isn't the same world he lived in. No, Marcus agreed, watching a security guard make his rounds through the construction site. But the principles are the same. You respect the land, you respect the people who came before you, and you respect the community you're building in. They've done none of that. Sarah paused at the door. I'll have more information by tomorrow evening. But, Marcus, once we start down this path, there's no going back. You'll be taking on people with unlimited resources and no scruples. Marcus looked around Elena's kitchen, with its mismatched chairs and photographs of family gatherings, at the woman who'd stood by him when he'd had nothing to offer but anger and wild accusations. This was worth protecting. This was worth fighting for. They should have thought of that before they stole my land, he said. The demolition crew arrived at dawn, their heavy machinery rumbling through the pristine streets of Meridian Heights like mechanical dinosaurs invading a suburban paradise. Marcus watched from his trailer window as the residents emerged from their luxury units, coffee cups in hand, faces twisted with disbelief and rage. He'd given them 72 hours' notice. More than legal required. More than they'd given the families who used to live here before Blackstone razed their neighborhood for this monument to greed. Now those families had their justice, even if they'd never know it. Sarah Chen appeared at his door just as the first wrecking ball swung toward the central fountain. You can't do this, she said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Behind her, other residents gathered like a well-dressed mob, their morning routines shattered by the reality of Marcus's ownership. Actually, I can. Marcus stepped outside, hard hat under his arm. Funny how property rights work when you're on the right side of them. The wrecking ball connected with the fountain in a shower of concrete and twisted metal. Water gushed across the manicured courtyard, turning the perfect landscape into a muddy wasteland. Several residents screamed. Sarah's face had gone pale. We'll sue you for everything. This is destruction of property. This is my property. Marcus's voice cut through her protests. Check the paperwork your lawyers filed yesterday. Every purchase agreement, every mortgage, every insurance policy, all null and void. You bought units that were built without permission on land you didn't own. Behind Sarah, a man in an expensive suit pushed forward. Marcus recognized him from the files Tommy had compiled. Richard Voss, pharmaceutical executive, Unit 4 billions. You're destroying millions in property value. Do you have any idea what you've done to our investments? Your investments? Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Tell me, Mr. Voss, what did you invest in the community that was here before? The family's Blackstone displaced to build your playground. Voss's face flushed red. That's not our responsibility. We bought these units in good faith. Good faith. Marcus repeated the words slowly. Where was your good faith when Mrs. Rodriguez lost her home because she couldn't navigate Blackstone's legal maze? Where was it when the Jackson family had to move 3 kids into a 1-bedroom apartment across town because this development priced them out of their own neighborhood? Another crash echoed across the complex as the wrecking ball found Unit 1A's floor-to-ceiling windows. The sound was beautiful, not just the destruction, but the silence that followed. For once, these people had no lawyers to call, no money to throw at the problem, no system to manipulate in their favor. Sarah tried a different approach, her voice softening. Marcus, please. I know you're angry, but this won't bring your father back. This won't undo what Blackstone did. You're right. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. But it'll make sure they can't do it again. Not here, not to anyone else. His phone buzzed. Tommy's voice crackled through the speaker. Blackstone's legal team is mobilizing. 3 black SUVs just left their headquarters. And Marcus, there's something else. I've been monitoring their communications. They're not just planning a legal response. Marcus glanced at the growing crowd of residents, then at the demolition crew working methodically through the complex. How long do I have? 20 minutes, maybe 30. Understood. Marcus ended the call and turned back to Sarah. I suggest you and your neighbors gather whatever you absolutely need and leave. Now. This is our home, she protested. No, Marcus said quietly. This was someone else's home. You're just squatters with expensive furniture. As if summoned by his words, 3 black SUVs rounded the corner, followed by a convoy of police cars. Marcus felt a familiar calm settle over him, the same feeling he'd had in Afghanistan when enemy contact was imminent. The waiting was over. James Blackstone emerged from the lead SUV like a general surveying a battlefield. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the fury radiating from the man who had never lost, never been challenged by someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated or buried in paperwork. The demolition crew had stopped working, their equipment idle as the situation shifted. Marcus spoke into his radio. Keep going. Don't stop until I tell you to stop. The wrecking ball resumed its methodical destruction. Blackstone strode across the muddy courtyard, flanked by lawyers and security personnel. When he reached Marcus, his face was a mask of controlled rage. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Blackstone said. Marcus smiled. Actually, I do. You're the man who thought he owned this town, past tense. The developer's eyes narrowed. This isn't over. No, Marcus agreed, watching another section of luxury facade crumble. It's just beginning. The surveillance footage Marcus had retrieved painted a damning picture, but Detective Rivera's reaction wasn't what Jake had expected. She sat across from him in the diner booth, her coffee growing cold as she studied the USB drive with a mixture of frustration and resignation. This is good work, she said finally, sliding the drive back across the Formica table. But it's also fruit of the poisonous tree. You obtained this illegally. Jake's jaw tightened. So what? We just pretend it doesn't exist? I didn't say that. Rivera leaned forward, lowering her voice. But I can't use it in any official capacity. However, if someone were to hypothetically tip off the FBI's white-collar crime unit about suspicious financial activities at Meridian Development, and if they were to obtain their own warrant for these records, how long would that take? Weeks, maybe months. She met his eyes. Do you have that kind of time? Jake thought about the demolition notices, about families like the Kowalskis facing eviction. No, we don't. Rivera nodded grimly. Then you need to be very careful about your next moves. Blackwood's people aren't just playing dirty, they're dangerous. That fire at Mrs. Chen's wasn't random. The weight of her words settled between them. Jake had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. He thought about Tommy's kids, about all the innocent people caught in this web. There's something else, Rivera continued. The medical examiner finished the preliminary report on Tony's accident. The brake lines were definitely tampered with. Jake's hands clenched into fists on the table. Can you prove Blackwood ordered it? Not yet, but we're building a case. The problem is, these people are smart. They use intermediaries, shell companies, contractors who can't be traced back to them. She paused. Unless someone forces their hand. The implication hung in the air between them. Rivera couldn't officially encourage what Jake was planning, but she wasn't exactly discouraging it either. After leaving the diner, Jake drove to the construction site where it all began. The luxury condos rose like glass and steel monuments to greed, their windows reflecting the grey October sky. A few residents had already moved in, their expensive cars gleaming in the parking garage below. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Emergency meeting tonight. Someone leaked about the property transfer. The meeting was held in St. Mary's basement, but the usual crowd had swelled to include nearly 100 residents from the surrounding neighborhoods. Word was spreading, and not all of it was good. They're saying you're some kind of con artist, Mrs. Kowalski told Jake as people filtered in. That you're working with the developers to drive up property values. Jake wasn't surprised. Blackwood's people were good at manipulating public opinion. What do you think? The old woman studied his face for a long moment. I think a con artist wouldn't have fixed my heating for free last week. But not everyone knows you like I do. Elena called for quiet, but the room remained restless. Voices overlapped in multiple languages, the tension palpable. She outlined what they'd learned about the fraudulent sales, but skeptical murmurs rippled through the crowd. How do we know this isn't all made up? Called out a man Jake didn't recognize. How do we know he's not just trying to cash in like everyone else? Before Jake could respond, Tommy stood up from the back row. His arm was still in a sling from the accident, but his voice was steady and strong. Because he saved my life, Tommy said, and the room fell silent. When my brakes failed on that job site, Jake pulled me out of that truck before it went over the edge. Could have been killed himself. He looked directly at the skeptical man. You think someone planning a con would risk his life for a stranger? The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. Jake caught Tommy's eye and nodded his thanks. Elena seized the moment. We have documentation proving the sales were fraudulent. We have evidence of bribery and corruption, but we need to move fast before they can cover their tracks. What are you proposing? Asked Father Miguel from the front row. Jake stood up. Tomorrow morning I'm going to do something that will force them into the open, but I need everyone here to be ready. When this breaks, there's going to be chaos. The media, the police, maybe federal agents. Some of you might face retaliation. What kind of retaliation? Someone asked nervously. Jake thought about Tony's brake lines, about Mrs. Chen's fire, the kind that's already happened to people who got in their way. A heavy silence settled over the room. Jake could see the fear in their faces, but also something else, determination. These were people who'd been pushed around for too long. So what's it going to be? Elena asked. Do we stand together or do we let them win? One by one, hands began to rise around the room. The silence in Marcus Chen's office stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Jake watched the developer's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally, a calculating coldness that reminded him why he'd never trusted men in expensive suits. You're bluffing, Chen said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Even if you somehow own the land, the city won't let you demolish occupied buildings. There are laws, procedures. Funny thing about procedures, Jake interrupted, sliding another document across the mahogany desk. When you cut corners to fast-track construction, those same procedures can work against you pretty quick. Chen's hands trembled slightly as he read the demolition permits Jake had somehow acquired. The man's empire was crumbling in real time, and Jake found himself savoring each crack in that polished facade. The residents have rights, Chen's lawyer interjected, speaking for the first time since Jake had laid out his evidence. You can't just evict people without proper notice. Jake leaned back in the leather chair, a position that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago when he'd been sleeping in his truck, already handled. Every tenant gets full relocation assistance, first month's rent paid, and a cash settlement for their trouble. Unlike some people, I believe in taking care of folks. The dig hit its mark. Chen's jaw clenched, and Jake could see the man calculating his losses. 50 million in construction costs, another 20 in projected profits, plus the legal nightmare of explaining to investors how he'd built luxury condos on land he never actually owned. What do you want? Chen asked, the question barely above a whisper. Justice, Jake said simply. You took something that wasn't yours, got rich off other people's misery, and thought nobody would ever call you on it. Well, surprise, somebody just did. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia, Channel 7 news van just pulled up outside. You sure about this? Jake was sure. He'd spent too many years watching men like Chen steamroll over people like him, hiding behind lawyers and paperwork and the assumption that money could solve any problem. Today that assumption died. I want you to personally apologize to every family you displaced from the old neighborhood, Jake continued, on camera. And I want a fund established for community development, 20 million should do it. Real development, not gentrification disguised as progress. That's extortion, the lawyer sputtered. No, Jake corrected, that's consequences. Extortion would be if I demanded money for myself. This is about making things right for the people you stepped on. Chen stood abruptly, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his empire. From this height, the construction sites looked like ant farms, the workers mere specks serving his vision. But Jake knew those specks had names, families, dreams of their own. The media circus will destroy both of us, Chen said without turning around. My reputation, your privacy. Once this story breaks, our lives won't be our own. My life hasn't been my own since I came home to find strangers living on my father's land, Jake replied. At least now I get to choose how the story ends. A knock at the door interrupted them. Chen's secretary entered, her composure cracked. Mr. Chen, there are reporters in the lobby. Security is trying to contain them, but— Let them up, Jake said, rising from his chair. Mr. Chen has a statement to make. The next hour passed in a blur of camera lights and rapid-fire questions. Jake watched Chen stumble through his prepared remarks, watched the man's carefully constructed image crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. The developer tried to spin it as a good-faith settlement of a property dispute, but the reporters smelled blood in the water. Mr. Reeves, a young journalist called out, what's your next move? Will you rebuild the original neighborhood? Jake considered the question. He could restore everything exactly as it was, bring back the familiar rhythms of the old community. Or he could try something different, something better. A neighborhood that honored the past while embracing the future, where working families could afford to live without being pushed out by the next wave of development. We're going to build something new, he said finally. Something that serves the community instead of displacing it. And we're going to do it right. As the crowd of reporters filed out, Chen remained by the windows, staring down at his diminished kingdom. Jake almost felt sorry for him. Almost. This isn't over, Chen said quietly. Yeah, it is, Jake replied, heading for the door. You just don't know it yet. Outside, Sophia waited by his truck, grinning. So, how does it feel to be the David who actually beat Goliath? Jake looked back at the gleaming tower, then at the neighborhood beyond where real people lived real lives. Ask me when we break ground on something worth building. The warehouse felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, charged with an energy that made Marcus's skin crawl. He'd chosen this place carefully, abandoned, isolated, but close enough to civilization that what happened here would matter. The developers had taken everything from him through lawyers and permits and official stamps. Now he'd show them what real power looked like. Vincent Chen sat zip-tied to a metal chair in the center of the space, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained. The arrogant developer who'd smiled so smugly during their first meeting now looked pale and haggard. His eyes tracked Marcus's movements with the desperate alertness of prey. You can't possibly think this will work, Chen said, his voice hoarse from hours of shouting. People know where I am. They'll find me. Marcus adjusted the camera he'd set up on a tripod, ensuring Chen filled the frame. Behind the developer, carefully arranged, were blueprints, contracts, and photographs, all the evidence of the conspiracy that had stolen his inheritance. The morning light filtering through grimy windows cast everything in harsh relief. Actually, Vincent, your people think you're in Portland meeting with investors. Amazing how easy it was to send those emails from your account. Marcus stepped back from the camera, satisfied with the setup. Technology's wonderful when you know how to use it. The past weeks had been a masterclass in modern warfare. While Chen and his associates had operated in boardrooms and courthouses, Marcus had learned their digital vulnerabilities. Sarah's investigative skills, combined with Tommy's street connections, had revealed more than just financial crimes. They'd uncovered a pattern of corruption that reached deep into the city's planning department. Chen's phone, lying on a nearby table, buzzed with incoming messages. Marcus glanced at the screen, watching notifications pile up from concerned business partners, city officials, and the FBI agents who'd been quietly building their own case. The beautiful thing about evidence, Marcus said, picking up a thick manila folder, is how it multiplies once you start looking. Your little land grab on my property? That was just the beginning. Turns out you've been pulling this con for years. He opened the folder, revealing photographs of other properties, other families displaced by Chen's systematic exploitation of bureaucratic loopholes, elderly couples forced from homes their families had owned for generations, small business owners bankrupted by sudden zoning changes, a whole network of corruption disguised as legitimate development. Those people couldn't fight back because they played by your rules, Marcus continued. They believed in the system, filed their appeals, hired lawyers they couldn't afford, trusted that justice would prevail. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't have that kind of faith. Chen's composure finally cracked. What do you want? Money? I can transfer funds right now. Whatever you think this is worth, you still don't get it. Marcus activated the camera, its red recording light casting an ominous glow. This isn't about money, it's about accountability. The warehouse door slid open with a metallic screech. Sarah entered, followed by FBI agent Rivera and a team of federal investigators. Chen's eyes widened as he recognized the woman who'd been documenting his empire's crimes for months. Mr. Torres, Agent Rivera nodded, her expression carefully neutral. I trust Mr. Chen has been cooperating with your interview process? Marcus stepped away from the camera, his work complete. He's been very educational. Amazing what people reveal when they think they're bargaining for their lives. The truth hit Chen like a physical blow. His face cycled through confusion, realization, and finally rage. You're working with them. This whole thing was a federal investigation that you just provided the final evidence for, Sarah finished, her camera still rolling. Every confession, every detail about your operation, every name you gave up trying to save yourself, all admissible in court. Agent Rivera gestured to her team, who began processing the scene with professional efficiency. The warehouse wasn't an abandoned crime scene. It was an elaborately staged interview room designed to make Chen believe he was facing a vengeful vigilante rather than the justice system he'd spent years corrupting. Marcus watched them work, feeling a satisfaction deeper than revenge. Chen would face trial for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The victims of his schemes would receive compensation. The officials he'd corrupted would face their own investigations. The beautiful thing about the system, Marcus said, echoing Chen's own words from months ago, is how well it works when you feed it the right information. As they led Chen away in federal custody, he turned back toward Marcus with something approaching respect in his eyes. How long have you been planning this? Marcus considered the question. Since the moment I realized that beating you meant becoming better than you. Turns out that wasn't as hard as I thought. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of engines starting. Justice, Marcus had learned, didn't always come through courtrooms and legal briefs. Sometimes it came through patience, planning, and the willingness to let your enemies destroy themselves. The boardroom at Meridian Development felt like a tomb. Marcus sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, watching 30 of the city's most powerful people squirm in their leather chairs. Real estate moguls, city councilmen, bank executives, construction magnates, all of them had profited from his stolen land, and now their empires hung by a thread. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, his voice carrying the weight of months of careful planning. I'm sure you're wondering why I've gathered you here today. Councilman Peterson shifted nervously. Look, Mr. Hayes, if this is about some perceived slight... Perceived? Marcus's laugh was cold as winter steel. $17.3 million in profits. That's what you've all made collectively from my land over the past year. Not perceived, gentlemen. Documented. He slid manila folders across the table to each person present. Inside were detailed financial records, construction permits, sales figures, and most damning of all, communications between them, discussing how to handle the Hayes problem if he ever returned. Mayor Davidson opened his folder with trembling fingers. His face went ashen as he read his own emails back to himself. "How did you get these?" Marcus gestured to Jake, who stepped forward from the shadows. "Turns out when you treat your IT consultant like furniture, he hears things, sees things, records things." Jake's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard. The wall-mounted screen flickered to life, displaying a web of connections, money trails, contract dates, zoning approvals that had been fast-tracked through backroom deals. "This is corporate espionage," snarled Richard Kessler, CEO of Pinnacle Holdings. "We'll have you arrested." "With what evidence?" Marcus asked pleasantly. Everything here was obtained legally. Public records requests, FOIA inquiries, willing testimony from your own employees who were tired of being complicit in fraud. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Marcus could smell their fear. Expensive cologne couldn't mask the acrid scent of panic sweat. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued, standing and walking slowly around the table like a predator circling wounded prey. "Each of you is going to make this right. Full restitution for profits made from my stolen land, plus damages for emotional distress and lost opportunity. You can't prove ownership," Peterson protested weakly. The property was abandoned, unregistered, was being the operative phrase. Marcus nodded to Jake again. The screen changed to show a freshly filed deed, properly registered and notarized. "Funny thing about inheritance law. Turns out I had 7 years to claim my birthright. Filed the paperwork 3 months ago, backdated to my father's death. All perfectly legal." The implications hit them like a freight train. If Marcus owned the land retroactively, every sale, every construction permit, every mortgage was built on quicksand. "You're talking about billions in market corrections," whispered Janet Morrison from Metropolitan Bank. "The housing market would collapse, would it?" Marcus's eyes glittered dangerously. "I suppose that depends on how cooperative you all are." He returned to his seat, leaning back with the casual confidence of a man holding all the cards. "I've prepared settlement agreements for each of you. Sign them, and this stays between us. Refuse," he shrugged. "Well, I've got a press conference scheduled for this afternoon. Channel 7 seems very interested in a story about corruption in city planning." The folder rustling sounded like dead leaves as they frantically read their individual terms. Marcus had done his homework. Each settlement was precisely calculated to hurt but not destroy. He wanted justice, not apocalypse. "This is extortion," Davidson muttered. "This is consequences," Marcus corrected. "For 30 years, you people have carved up this city like a Christmas turkey, deciding who gets what, who matters, who doesn't. You destroyed my family's legacy because you thought I was nobody. Just another expendable working man you could bulldoze." He stood again, his calloused hands flat on the table. "But here's what you never understood. Being underestimated is a superpower. While you were counting your money and planning your next heist, I was learning, planning, building." The silence stretched taut as a piano wire. Finally, Peterson reached for his pen. "The amount is acceptable." One by one they signed, some with resignation, others with barely contained fury, but they all signed. They had no choice. Marcus had made sure of that. As the last signature dried on the last contract, Marcus gathered the documents with deliberate care. "Pleasure doing business with you all." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and gentlemen, if any of you think about retaliating against me, my friends, or anyone who helped me, remember that everything you've seen today is backed up in multiple locations. Insurance, you might say." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving 30 of the city's elite to contemplate the wreckage of their carefully constructed world. Outside, the sun felt warmer on his face than it had in months. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus stood at the edge of what had once been his grandfather's land. The luxury condos gleamed in the early light, their glass facades reflecting the sky like mirrors of broken promises. But today, those reflections would shatter. His phone buzzed with the final confirmation. The demolition crew would arrive in 3 hours. "You sure about this?" Tommy asked, standing beside him with a hard hat tucked under his arm. "Once those wrecking balls start swinging, there's no going back." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with determination. They built their empire on stolen ground. Time to return it to the earth. Behind them, a convoy of news vans pulled up along the street. Word had leaked about the impending demolition, and now the media circus Marcus had carefully orchestrated was beginning. He'd spent weeks planting seeds with investigative journalists, feeding them breadcrumbs about Blackstone Development's shady practices. Today, those seeds would bloom into a very public reckoning. Victoria Blackstone's black sedan screeched to a halt at the construction site's entrance. She emerged like a force of nature, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt with military precision. Her face was a mask of barely controlled fury as she approached Marcus. "You can't do this," she hissed, brandishing a thick folder of documents. "We have injunctions, restraining orders, emergency court filings." "All filed too late," Marcus interrupted calmly. "My lawyers made sure of that. Amazing how quickly the legal system moves when you have the right documentation and deep enough pockets." He smiled coldly. "Turns out I'm not as powerless as you thought." Victoria's composure cracked. "You don't understand what you're destroying. These units are already sold. There are families moving in next month. The economic impact—" "Should have thought about that before you forged my signature and bribed city officials," Marcus said. He pulled out his own folder, thick with evidence his private investigators had gathered. "Did you really think nobody would notice the pattern? 3 other properties in the last 5 years, same method, same payoffs to the same planning commission members." The color drained from Victoria's face as she recognized photocopies of bank records, recorded conversations, email chains she thought had been deleted. Marcus had used her own tactics against her, but with the patience and methodical precision of someone who'd spent years learning from every slight, every dismissal. "The FBI is very interested in your business practices," Marcus continued. "Racketeering, fraud, conspiracy. Turns out white-collar crime carries some serious sentences these days." A rumbling sound grew louder as the demolition equipment rounded the corner. 3 massive machines, a wrecking ball crane, an excavator and a bulldozer, approached like mechanical harbingers of justice. The media crews scrambled to get the best angles, cameras rolling as the story of David versus Goliath played out in real time. Detective Sarah Chen emerged from an unmarked car, flanked by 2 federal agents. She walked directly to Victoria, her expression professional but satisfied. "Victoria Blackstone, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal racketeering statutes." Victoria's lawyer, the same slick attorney who'd tried to intimidate Marcus months ago, rushed forward with briefcases full of motions and appeals. But the handcuffs were already clicking into place around Victoria's wrists. "This isn't over," Victoria spat at Marcus as the agents led her away. "You have no idea what you've started. There are people involved in this, powerful people who won't—" "Let them come," Marcus said quietly. "I've got plenty of evidence left to share." The first swing of the wrecking ball sent tremors through the ground. Glass exploded outward in glittering cascades as the luxury facade crumbled. Each impact was thunder, each collapse a small earthquake of justice served. Marcus watched impassively as months of illegal construction dissolved into rubble and dust. Residents from the surrounding neighborhood, the ones Victoria's development had tried to price out, gathered along the fence line. Some cheered, others simply watched in stunned silence as the symbol of their displacement came crashing down. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd been fighting eviction from her family home next door, appeared beside Marcus. She pressed a thermos of coffee into his hands without a word, her eyes bright with tears. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said softly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. He thought of the old man's calloused hands, the stories about building things that lasted, the values that couldn't be bought or bulldozed. By noon, where million-dollar condos had stood that morning, only broken concrete and twisted steel remained. The land lay open to the sky once more, wounded but free. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed his architect. Tomorrow, they would break ground on something different, affordable housing with green spaces, built with union labor and community input. The powerful had held all the cards for so long, they'd forgotten that the deck could be reshuffled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus stood before the assembled crowd. Residents of Riverside Commons clustered nervously behind the police barricade, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Television crews had arrived at dawn, their cameras capturing every moment of what the news anchors were already calling the Riverside standoff. Detective Sarah Chen stepped forward, her hands raised peacefully. "Marcus, we need to talk. There has to be a way to resolve this without anyone getting hurt." Marcus looked down at her from his position atop the excavator, the detonator still clutched in his weathered hand. The explosives he'd spent the night planting were invisible to the crowd, but everyone could feel their presence like a held breath. "Funny how everyone wants to talk now. Where were all you people when they were stealing my land?" "The courts will sort out the ownership dispute," Chen called back. "But this isn't the way." A bitter laugh escaped Marcus's throat. "The courts? Lady, I've been through your courts. I've filed papers, hired lawyers I couldn't afford, sat in waiting rooms for months. You know what I learned? Poor people don't win in court. We just get buried deeper." From somewhere in the crowd, Victoria Hastings pushed through the police line. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her usually perfect hair disheveled. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Marcus, please, we can work something out. Financial compensation, a settlement." "Blood money," Marcus spat. "You think you can buy your way out of this? You destroyed something that wasn't yours to touch." The weight of his father's letter pressed against his chest, tucked safely in his shirt pocket. The old man's words echoed in his mind. "This land is your inheritance, your future. Don't let them take what belongs to us." But as Marcus looked out at the faces below, residents who had nothing to do with the developer's greed, police officers just doing their jobs, reporters documenting what might become a tragedy, he felt the rage that had sustained him beginning to crack. "My father died thinking I was a failure," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Thought I'd never amount to anything because I couldn't play their games, couldn't navigate their system. But you know what? He was wrong. I'm not a failure. I'm just not willing to become like you." Victoria stepped closer to the excavator. "What do you want, Marcus? Really want?" For a moment, the question hung in the air like morning mist. Marcus had spent so many sleepless nights dreaming of revenge, of watching the condos crumble, of making these people feel as powerless as they'd made him feel. But now, with the power to destroy everything they'd built, he found himself thinking about something else entirely. "I want my father's workshop back," he said quietly. "I want the oak tree where my mother used to read to me. I want the garden where she grew tomatoes every summer. I want the life you stole from me." "We can't bring those things back," Victoria said, her voice softer now. "But we can build something new, something better." Marcus shook his head. "No more building, no more taking, no more lies about progress and development." His grip tightened on the detonator. "Sometimes you have to tear everything down to start over." The crowd held its collective breath. News helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. In the distance, Marcus could see the SWAT team taking position, their rifles trained on him despite Detective Chen's efforts to keep this peaceful. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "You know what the funny thing is? I never actually planted any explosives." The confession rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Victoria's mouth fell open. Detective Chen's hand moved instinctively toward her weapon, then stopped. Marcus held up the device in his hand, a garage door opener with some electrical tape and a small antenna attached. "Convincing, isn't it? Amazing what you can build when you actually know how things work." He climbed down from the excavator slowly, his hands visible. The real explosive was the truth. The real weapon was making you all pay attention for once, making you see what happens when ordinary people get pushed too far. As the police moved in to arrest him, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow, the story would be front-page news. The illegal land grab, the forged documents, the corruption, it would all come out now. Victoria's empire would crumble under investigation. The residents would learn their homes were built on lies. Detective Chen approached with handcuffs, but her expression was almost respectful.
That was quite a gamble, Marcus.
Sometimes the powerless have to bluff, he replied, extending his wrists. But the cards were real. They were always real. As they led him away, Marcus looked back one last time at the land that had started it all. His father's legacy, his mother's memory, his family's stolen future. He might be going to jail, but he was finally going as himself.